the part of you that you consider you, roughly speaking, Jung considered the ego. And you might think about that as the most individual part of your psychophysiological being. I mean, the difference between individual and collective in that sense is that you share very many attributes with other people, obviously. Your physical form is very much like that of other people, and then you share attributes with other living creatures way back down the phylogenetic chain. And so in that regard, there's nothing specifically individual about you. But the part of you that you identify with most completely and that you regard as unique, that's the Jungian ego. Now, Jung sort of conceptualized your psyche as a, I would say as a place, I suppose, that many spirits could inhabit. And you might think about a spirit from the Jungian perspective as a personality that can inhabit the psyche. And so, like all the psychoanalysts, Jung regarded the psyche as a relatively loose collection of partially integrated personalities. And each of those personalities had their own perspective, their own thoughts, like their own way of looking at the world, that would be the perspective, their own thoughts, their own emotions, their own habits, their own actions, and those were roughly aggregated into some sort of unity, and that was the ego. Now, the ego has a public face, and the public face Jung called the persona. Persona means mask, and the persona is both that part of you that you show to other people instead of the part that you hide, and then also to some degree it might be the form that your ego takes even to you. So for example, if you're a naive person, you might think that your public face is all there is of you. The rough difference between the ego and the persona might be conceptualized this way, that there are things that you think that you won't say in public, maybe not even in private. Some of those things you're pretty aware of, and those would be thoughts that are relevant to the ego but not the persona. And then some of them you don't even really want to be aware of, and Jung would consider those more associated with the shadow. Now, the shadow, the existence of the shadow, first of all, you might want to remember that the best way to conceptualize Jung's archetypal constructions is in some sense as metaphors. So you could say that, well, Jung thought that it was useful to separate up the psyche into persona and ego and then shadow. It isn't that there aren't other ways that it could be broken up, but breaking it up this way is useful for certain purposes, and Jung regarded this terminology as particularly useful from a psychoanalytic perspective and also from a historical perspective. So perhaps the divisions could be made otherwise, and there are many ways of looking at archetypes, but this is sufficiently useful to progress with. Now, people's personas are generally somewhat harmless and somewhat socialized. If you don't know how to act in public, you don't have a well-crafted persona. Some of you are going to be the kinds of relatively deep-thinking intellectuals who think that small talk is nonsense. And there's some utility in that thinking, because in some sense, from a philosophical sense, obviously it's nonsense. But if you don't know how to make small talk, basically what that means is that you have a poorly developed persona. And what that'll mean is that you're not going to do very well, at least at the beginning of social engagements, because you need to be able to convince people that you're basically civilized and social before it's even reasonable for them to go beyond pleasantries with you. And the ability to exchange pleasantries in a relatively banal way in a variety of different circumstances is part of having a persona. And you don't want to denigrate the utility of that, because you need it. You know, as you progress in your careers, for example, you're going to be thrust into situations where you don't really know anyone, and the purpose of the gathering is to familiarize a large number of people with one another. And there's a skill that's associated with that that's somewhat glib social ability. The Jungians would say, well, you shouldn't, if you don't have a persona, you're just a disaster, but by the same token, you shouldn't be only persona. Because one of the possibilities is that the ego can identify with the persona, and then the person thinks that they are what they show the social world. And the problem with that, at least from the Jungian perspective, is that A, people are a lot more than the persona, they're a lot more than the ego, and B, a lot of the things that make them more than mere persona or more than mere ego are not necessarily things that are acceptable in casual public gatherings. So for example, because of your psychophysiological makeup, you all have the capacity for aggression. Now a lot of you, especially the ones that are more agreeable, you could say that even it's either that capacity for aggression has been underdeveloped because you've identified with a certain mode of social being, or you could say perhaps, if, to the degree that agreeableness is temperamental, that the aggressive tendency isn't as powerful in you as it is in other people. That might lead you to make judgments like, and I'm sure some of you, perhaps some of you who had an angry parent, or particularly an angry father, have decided at some point in your life that to be aggressive is wrong. To be angry is wrong, for example. Or to be aggressive is wrong. It's morally wrong. One of the things that happens in psychotherapy very frequently, though, is that people come into psychotherapy for a variety of reasons. Some of them are merely practical. They're having problems in adaptation because their lives have got very, very complicated and they really don't know what to do about it. Sometimes they go into psychotherapy because they have very high levels of negative emotion, and that can be associated with the first problem. But very often they come into therapy because they're getting pushed around constantly, and they really don't have anything that's a sufficiently well-developed personal identity. And generally, that happens, by the way, more often with women than it does with men, and that's because women are, by temperament, more agreeable than men, and perhaps also by socialization. Temperament certainly plays a big role. Often then, the goal of therapy is assertiveness training. And assertiveness training you could think of as the behavioral psychologist's equivalent to incorporating the shadow. So, you know, you may think, well, it's a necessary part of existence to be nice to other people. And there's some truth in that. Not really. It's a very shallow way of looking at the world, because nice is not a very sophisticated word. But even if that's the word that you do use, you should also be nice to yourself. And sometimes what that means is that you have to put forward your own wishes and desires in a manner that causes a certain amount of conflict. And in order to withstand that conflict, you have to be able to draw on the sources of aggression that in some sense are a deep part of your inbuilt set of possibilities. Now, the reason that's necessary, in part from a biological perspective, is that people are often afraid of engaging in conflict because they're afraid, because conflict can be real trouble. And anger inhibits fear. So if you don't have a well-developed capacity for, well, we could say rage, then you can't overcome your fear, and then you can't stand up for yourself, and then you're going to get run over. Now the problem with that is that if you get run over enough, it'll make you resentful, and then that will make you aggressive, except it'll make you aggressive in sneaky, underground, and somewhat unconscious ways that are much less likely to be productive than, you know, a frank exchange of viewpoints and some conscious negotiation. So one of the things I do in therapy for people who need assertiveness training is I get them to pay attention to their resentment, and resentment is often a good avenue into the shadow, because first of all, resentment is a pretty destructive emotion. It's an extremely useful emotion, but it can be very destructive because it gives rise to, well, first of all, a sense of victimization, and second then, the underground growth of all sorts of ideas of revenge and vengeance, and also a kind of stubborn non-cooperativeness, because who wants to cooperate when they feel taken advantage of? And so part of Jung's idea with regards to the shadow is that obviously the social world wants you to be peaceful and predictable, and maybe even easy to get along with. But that doesn't necessarily mean that peaceful, predictable, and easy to get along with, A, are the only virtues, because they're certainly not, and one thing we know about virtues is that if they're taken to too great an extreme, they become vices. And B, they're certainly not the only virtues. You know, there are what you might call darker virtues, so to speak. They're more dangerous virtues in some sense, because they harness forces that can be very destructive if they're not utilized consciously, and aggression is certainly an example of that. So